Hello, hello, everyone. So let me put on some Taylor Swift here. I know that everyone would be super sad if I didn't lead with Taylor Swift. Any cravings? Jump in the chat and tell me if you have any Taylor Swift song cravings. Let's see what I've got here that comes up right away. Oh, we could do, how about mine? Oh, Style. Okay, I'll do Style. Let's do Style by Taylor Swift. That could be our intro song. We gotta ease the pain of the awkward intro of a normal webinar. There you go, putting that on. So anyone who's jumping into the chat, I see everyone piling in. If you jump into the chat, give me your name, the company you're with, your role, and one thing that you want to get better at when it comes to cold calls. So that can be the intro. So I know what you all want to focus on or get better at. Or a cold call story, your worst cold call that you've had or received. I'm going to open up the gamut to all three. Cold call you, so name, company, role, and one thing you struggle at when it comes to cold calls. A great story that you have in terms of cold calls, or the worst one you've ever had. Overcoming objections. That's a great one, Jack. What objection is your favorite? Oh, we got a lot of objections here. Looking for tips. Fiona's looking for tips. Objections. You all are coming in for objections. Okay, well, that's not what I was going to focus on, but now I'm thinking that I should spend a couple of minutes on objections here so that everyone has. Want to get rid of that fear of being rejected. Man, that is a tough one. Elena, that's a really tough one. Intro psych. Okay, we got intro psychology for cold calls. What else? Personalizing cold calls. That's a great one, Susan. Keeping them on the phone. Yes. Holiday objections. John dinged in with holiday objections. What's an example of a holiday objection? Like they're too busy over the holidays. They're out of town over the holidays. Yes, the fear of rejection is a completely different webinar, Roberta. That's completely true. Busy end of November. Yeah, that's one that I didn't even think about. We're good. Someone said we're good is the objection that they want to counter. So I'm going to give a couple more minutes or 1 more minute, 60 more seconds, getting them to engage. That's a good one. Mark, I would, from a high level, I would ask them questions that aren't agenda driven. Is the meaning the agenda is not non-agenda driven, but the agenda is to understand their situation, not to sell them. The more that they know that you're asking the types of questions that will lead them down a path that's going to be not going to fan out for the better. Okay, so why don't we jump in? I'm going to give 30 more seconds to any kind of things that you want to learn in terms of cold calls, and then we're going to jump in here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in the meantime, just so y'all can look at something other than this background. I'm actually back in Texas for a couple of days. I'm back in Dallas, my hometown. This is the loft that my TLDR, my dad built in hopes that I would come home more often. That's probably representing me in a really terrible light. So maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we can go ahead and jump in. So, and I'm going to kill off Taylor's song here so that we can focus. Welcome everyone to the 7 steps to a great cold call. I'm very, very excited about this webinar. So this is going to be a follow-up to the one-sheeter that was handed out at the tour. So that thing that's really, really big and laminated and looks like an actual menu or a placemat that you could put underneath your dinner table. That's what we're going to be following up on. And this, just from a high level, and I do think that it's worth mentioning, is sponsored by and powered by JustCall. So a very, very big friend of FlipTheScript. I'm not going to product pitch here because I know that you all will probably get nauseous if I do any kind of product pitch, but very, very great team. This is at a high level what they do, but they were a very big friend to me in terms of the tour and supporting it. and getting it moving and marketing and everything. They were really a very, very valuable partner to me. So I would suggest checking them out. Amazing team, and they can help basically trim out all of the manual dialing and all of the logging of logging everything and having to do that in to your CRM so that you can get that data. But I would go check them out, JustCall.io. Here's just a high level of what G2 thinks of them, but this is the value prop, no more manual dialing. So go to JustCall.io, check them out, give them a shout out. I would say give them 30 minutes of your time just to see what they do, because I'm probably falsely representing it. But today I'm going to transition decks. Today I wanted to go into the asset, like I mentioned, in terms of the cold call and how you can add some level of structure, how you can really be confident that you know what you're doing or where you're going. And I'm going to be deferring to this one sheeter. So I hope that you have it in front of you, the placemat in front of you, so that we can jump in here. But what I wanted to leave behind to be today, when it comes to cold calls and any kind of methodology in general, typically, they're going to iron out a methodology and they're going to say, follow this linear path. And the struggle with that, or at least what I had as a struggle with as a rep and as a team lead, was calls aren't linear. People bring up all kinds of things, all kinds of gotchas, different objections. They start to be human on the line, which is great. They start to ask, is this a salesperson? All kinds of different objections along the way. So I wanted to enable everyone with some level of structure of the cold call, more than just a methodology, but what's the structure of a call? What are all the tenets that you should be hitting? What are the things that you can say to them early on, to make them really feel like you're listening and that you are actually listening, but you can also achieve the goal of getting them to know your product, your wonderful value prop, in hopes that they'll jump on another call. So from a high level, before I jump in here, there are three things, and I haven't brought these up traditionally. There are three things about any cold outreach methodology, et cetera, that are going to be very, very important to get a hold of your buyer. The first thing is, do you get their attention? So cold call, it's easier because you're obviously talking to them, but this is the number one struggle. And I would say the most important struggle for people. The reason I say it's the most important struggle is because without getting their attention, you obviously don't have to worry about the other two. So getting someone's attention, I went into this in the content on the tour very heavily, but getting their attention is going to come down to how effectively do you pattern interrupt? So meaning your body is designed from an evolutionary standpoint to identify things that are different from quote unquote normal. So your body is trained to do that because you can't essentially encompass or ascertain all of the stimuli coming at you at one point. Like there's cars driving on the street, there are birds in the air, it's sunny, maybe there's some noise in the background. Your body can't absorb all of that at once. And so from a threat perspective, your body is designed to look at or pay attention to things that are not normal from the pre-existing perception that you have, so that you could be protective for yourself against them. So the number one way to get a hold of their attention is to break the pattern of what's normal. So the normal pattern of a cold call, for instance, is, they pick up and you start to go into, some people will go into they call it a pattern interrupt, but really it's become a pattern of, would you give me 30 seconds to tell you why I called? Or sometimes we're the number one blank, and this is what I called you about, and they'll speed up their pitch, in hopes that they can get it all in before their prospect hangs up. So that's what they're worried about, is their prospect's going to hang up. So how do I speed up my conversation so that my prospect stays in line? So the first piece is going to be, how do you pattern interrupt that, so that they stay on the phone longer enough to where you can get to the second most important thing about outreach. So the second most important thing about outreach is, once you do get their attention, are you speaking with relevance? And I'm going to hone in on relevance, on what that is. But relevance is going to be, are you talking about a problem that they have? And that's going to come down to how well do you know your buyer. So from a high level, if you can't identify your buyer and what they're metriced on, meaning what are the numbers that they are hired, fired, promoted, and demoted to drive, then that's the beginning. So if I can't off record mention of, like, I'm sure that we have AEs, BDRs, sales enablement, and marketing on the line. If I don't know that an AE, for instance, is metriced on quota attainment, I'm going to have a really hard time talking to them with any relevance. So that's just the beginning, is getting to know their metrics. But am I talking about a problem that they typically run into that they need to solve is going to be the second most important thing about outreach. And the third most important thing about outreach in general in the cold call, and then we're going to get into the structure here, is going to be from a psychology perspective, do I take care of them? So this is a bucket that's very rarely talked about. A great resource is Eric Byrne, a couple of books that you can read, Games People Play and Beyond Games and Scripts. But there are 3 different ego states in your body. You have to protect your buyer, that they don't have to buy despite who you are, and they don't necessarily buy because of who you are. You want who you are to be out of the way. That liking you is just a bonus and a nice thing, but that's really not why people are going to buy, eventually. So I have a lot of different friends that I haven't bought their products because I don't see the business value use case. It's not that I don't like them. It's not that I don't love them. It's that I don't see how that could put me in a different situation. So from the psychology view, there's a number of different ways that we transgress these sins and a number of different ways that we can take care of our buyers. But I'd be thinking about, do I not commanding someone to do something, not making them feel guilty about not reaching back out to us, not associating blame to them for not reaching back out to us, essentially not coming at them from the child ego state by saying something's unfair or correcting them or telling them that when they mention that competitor that wasn't real for you, that isn't a real competitor. So it's a logical move, but it hurts their ego state. And so they can tune out from there. So different conversation from a different time. So we're going to go into really all 3 of those in terms of this cold call structure and the wording, of how this is organized. But it is all 3 of those elements are at play, usually within a sales methodology or any kind of, template. Typically people will focus on, how do I be relevant to my buyer? And then best case scenarios, they'll focus on how do I pattern interrupt and get a hold of their attention with like a meme or something. But really we're going to achieve all 3 of these throughout this cold call. So let's dive in here. So the first piece of a cold call, I would lead with, hey, this is, someone picks up. And I say, this is Becc calling, on a recorded line, if you are using recorded software, on a recorded line from, and I would give them your company name. This is Becc calling on a recorded line from FlipTheScript. How have you been? So the psychology in this, just from a technique level, so that you can replicate this technique in the future, is your prospect's going to be in fight or flight mode at the very beginning of a cold call. So I would defer very heavily to how you operate when someone cold calls into you. So typically when someone calls from a number that I don't know, then the first thing I'm going to be wondering when I pick up is this a salesperson or is this someone I need to talk to? And they are mutually exclusive. So I'm not wondering, is this a relevant salesperson? I'm wondering, is this a salesperson? And if so, then I want them to go away and I inherently want to get off the phone. So in those first couple of seconds, this is going to be high risk for fight or flight time. And so if I ask, how are you? Then not only do I hit the sales pattern, but I also, I'm going to increase the risk that they are going to hang up because this isn't someone that I know. So how have you been? If I had to guess why it works on people, just for the first couple of seconds, is instead of wondering, is this a salesperson? They start to wonder, what's the pre-existing history between you and that person? So I think through when I was, when someone approaches you and says, hey, how have you been? It's good to see you again. The first things that are running through my mind is, crap, I don't know this person. How do I know this person? Clearly I've met them in the past. I'm the rude person who can't remember, where they came from. And some people have said from a psychology view, they're like, well, I don't like this because to some level, we haven't met before. But the goal here is really to get them open enough to where they can hear your pitch. So the goal should be clean. You know them, you know their company. If both of those aren't true, I'd report back to square one. You know them, you know their company, and you have a problem that you might be able to solve for them. So I would say, how have you been? And they're going to go into one of four things at this point. They're either, number one, going to go into, they'll say good, and they'll pause. So a lot of our prospects are going to play tough guy at the beginning of the call. And what they're doing is they're testing you. They're testing you to see if you keep going. They're testing you to see if you're like every other sales rep. They're testing you to see what your next move is. So if they say good, I would say that's the first option. Then I'll go into what your answer should be. The second option that they'll say, and this is the most rare case, but I would say they say, good, how are you? That they actually ask a question back. So I love it when I run into these people on the line. It's not often, but that they say, I'm doing great. How are you? The third option of what they'll lead into is they'll ask some type of question, myriad of different questions. Some are more malevolent than the others. But they'll say, this is who, calling on a recorded line with who, what company are you? What do you want? Is this a sales call? What do you all do? Are you the company that competes with blank? Those are examples of a lot of the questions that I've heard, but they'll ask some type of question here at the brink. And then the fourth case scenario is going to be that they sound audibly mad, or they sound like they're genuinely in the middle of something. So if you hear, like something in the background, or you hear them say something very, very snarky, that their response is like, I'm good. And they sound inherently upset. If they say, from a high level, again, what you're trying to do is interrupt the pattern of a normal salesperson. So a normal salesperson is going to blitz through their pitch regardless of the signs that the prospect communicates to you. So it's really, really interesting. We watch movies and we know just off of the shift of how someone shifts their eyes if someone's the killer or not in the movie. We can read signs extremely well. And then we get on a cold call and someone's like, I'm good. And we start blitzing through. We completely ignore the sign and we're like, great, well, I called to talk to you about X, Y, and Z, and we're the number one, provider of X, Y, and Z, and we've helped people do this. So my biggest tip from a high level here is to read into the moment, read the room, and use your cerebral thinking skills to know, to read how the person's doing. But if they say good, I say, great, I'm glad to hear that. If they say, great, how are you? I would be a human and I would say, I'm really good. Thank you for asking. The third case scenario, if they ask any type of question, regardless of the question, if they don't sound pissed, regardless of the question, I would say, that's a great question. And then I would proceed to step two. In the first, second, and third case scenario, all three of these, I would say this line and then report into step two. So if they say good, I say, great, I'm glad to hear that. The reason for my outreach is. If they say good, how are you? I say, I'm great, thank you for asking. Now, if they over error and they sound inherently really excited about something, if they say, I'm great, I would stop there with them. I would say, what makes you, it's only a Tuesday. What's so great about a Tuesday? And I would start to ask them questions on what's going on. So I would take the signals from your prospect on how they're doing. This person, if they say, I'm awesome, and you go straight into your pitch, they're going to think, this is a salesperson. But if I pause there for a second, I say, hey, what makes it so great? And they say, oh, well, I'm actually headed out to vacation tomorrow. I'd say, where are you going? What do you have planned? But the goal of this is not that you lose structure. The goal of this is that they see you as a human. A normal salesperson would keep going into their pitch. So I'd pause there, for a second and say, ask them a couple of questions to get their background. So I hear a lot about being a human in cold calls. And what being a human means is that you're responding to stimulus that a human would respond to. So if they say I'm awesome, I would say, why are you so awesome? All other questions, they say, if there's any kind of question, I'd say that's a great question. And I would go into step 2. The reason for my outreach is, and again, the only exception here is if they sound mad. If they sound mad or in the middle of something, if they say, I'm okay, I would pattern interrupt there. And I would say, hey, can I level with you for a second? You sound upset. Did I mess up in calling you? And what you'll usually hear in response to this is, no, it's not you. It's just, and they'll go into a diatribe, X, Y, and Z. It's just, I just got this report on my desk and X, Y, and Z. And they'll attribute the blame of why they're mad to something else because you just fell on your sword a little bit and they want to help pick you up. So again, even the goal of this one is that you're becoming more human. So the more that we enter our wonderful humanity into the beginning of a cold call, humanity being, I'm not trying to sell you something, humanity being, I want to take care of you, humanity being, I can read normal signs in a conversation, then the more that we're going to interrupt out of the pattern of a normal cold call so we can get a hold of their attention. So it makes it harder for them, essentially to hang up the phone on us and treat us like we have no identity because we just inserted our identity into this process. So the second step from here is going to be, I'm going to go into some level of personalization. So personalization, I don't have too much time to go into this. In the third webinar, I'm going to go into that very heavily, but personalization is going to be any messaging that is defined as one-to-one, meaning it should be a fact about them. They should believe in this portion, and it should become true, catch me if I can style, that you know who they are. So go to their LinkedIn profile, tease out something that they did, something that they said, an article that they wrote, some content they engage with, some kind of about me section, excerpt, some random fact about them. We're going to go into how to hook that. But how I would, from a structure perspective, insert these is if this is cold outbound, meaning there's no trigger that caused your outreach. And I know we went into that in the first webinar very heavily of what those triggers could be. Then I would say, the reason for my outreach is I saw that you wrote this article, online that was titled blank on scaling effective teams. And I was taking a look through it. And one line that really hit me was, it all comes down to quality. So I was curious to know if you've come across, and I would put their company name in there. I was curious to know if you've come across blank before. So if I'm going cold to outbound, that's how I'm going to leverage personalization to answer one of the questions in the chat. Now, if I have some type of trigger that I'm basing my outreach off of, and a trigger being defined as some type of movement on their behalf, their company's behalf, in relationship to your marketing team or not in relationship to your marketing team. So again, I went into these triggers very heavily in the first webinar if you want to check that out. But a postbound trigger, for instance, is any kind of trigger in relation to your marketing team that was non-hand raising. So they downloaded content, they attended a webinar like this, they attended an event like the tour, for instance. And then bridge-bound is a meaty category of there is some kind of movement or trigger not in relationship to your marketing team. So maybe they just received funding, or they requested a demo, but they didn't actually schedule one, or they just acquired someone, or they just moved companies, or they demoed with you in the past, but then they went dark. But what is the trigger here? And I would mention this trigger of, hey, the reason for my outreach is I noticed that you downloaded our content, for instance, downloaded a piece of content of ours. And then I would use the words, but more importantly, and I would change the conversation into a conversation about them. So the biggest sin that I see in relationship to content downloads, webinar registrants, event attendees, is that people call into these accounts and they say, like, I noticed you downloaded the content. And people are like, yeah, did you have any questions? No. And then they hang up the phone, because you're cooked. So this should be accompanied with, we shouldn't ignore this trigger. They downloaded content, they attended a webinar, they did something in relationship to our marketing team, they just received funding, they just acquired a company. But that's not the only reason that you should be reaching out. Part of the reason you should be reaching out is something that they did in specific. They wrote an article, they, had this blip in their About Me section, but the goal of this portion from a high level is to communicate to them that you are looking at them. They are not on a list of 8,000 prospects. They're not a number to you. You took the time to research them. So we view time investment as the human race does, as a tit for tat syndrome. You give me time by investing in me, and I all of a sudden want to give you time back. It's a wonderful thing about humanity. We're very reciprocal in nature. Someone gives me a gift, inherently, I innately want to give something back. So I would say within this portion, you want to give them the gift of researching them, knowing who they are. This is outside of the pattern of a normal salesperson. Makes me sick to say that, but it is. So the normal pattern of a salesperson is to not know who they are. So I would include some level of detail about who they are. So for cold outbound, if I have no trigger, I'm just going to go further in depth. If I do have a trigger, I'm going to say, notice that you attended the tour, but more importantly, I saw that you wrote this article on X, Y, and Z. So the goal of this portion, this is the antidote to people hanging up on you. My reps very rarely, if I can think of a handful of times that they got just hung up on. And if I had to guess why, it's because this is the medicine to the beginning of the call. Because the beginning of the call, they're expecting you to be a salesperson who doesn't know who they are. And so you're proving to them in the first portion that you're not just a salesperson, you're an actual human, and that you do know who they are to some degree. So the line I would finish off with is, the reason for my outreach is I saw that you wrote this article online, and I really liked it, by the way, where you're talking about X, Y, and Z. And I really like this excerpt where you said it comes down to quality. So I was curious to know if you've come across your company before. So at this point, you're going to hear one of two things. You're going to either hear yes, or you're going to hear no. As a caveat, if they want to talk about their content, meaning they're like, oh, I did write that article. Yeah. So when I was talking with my team, it really came to mind, and they'll start to go into that work. At that point, I would resist the urge to transition to your company and transition to your value prop. I, again, would ask some questions. So you don't want to just say like, hey, I saw you did this thing. I was curious to know if you came across my company before. They're like, yeah. And they really want to talk about that thing. I would resist the urge to say like, okay, cool, but we're done with that portion. I want to talk about, my company. So again, this is an antidote of them seeing you like a salesperson. So if they say, yeah, so I wrote that with my team when I was thinking about X, Y, and Z, and I would say, so how long ago was that? What was their reaction? And I would start to ask them normal questions about the content. They just gave you a signal that they want to talk about it. So talk about it. You can't talk about it the whole cold call, but if any one of these portions, if they say they're great and I ask them why, they say, they sound pissed and I ask them if it was my fault, or they start to talk about their content. When I'm going into that portion, I'm usually going 30 seconds, a minute, minute and a half, up until I hit what I call the breath point. And the breath point is going to be the point of the conversation where you notice that naturally they're ready to transition. So they're not unaware why you called, but this point where they're ready to transition in is going to be different for every person. So the reason I call it the breath point is when you're eating a meal, there's a point where you breathe in, you breathe out, and you decide to either keep eating or stop eating. I usually keep eating. But that's going to be different for every situation. Depends on how dense the food is, dependent on how much you've had to eat that day, etc. So at that point, that breath point is going to shift every time that you're eating. And the breath point in the conversation for your buyer is going to shift for them as well. Depends on how much they have going on, depends on their personality type. So JustCall for people who aren't familiar with it, is a great thing to look into. So the DISC profile means how you're geared essentially. And I am a high D, for instance, meaning I'm a driver. And what I crave is people getting into the meat of the conversation. I don't like chit chat. I don't like the beginning. I don't like, talking about the weekend and stuff. I want to cut straight into the meat. Now, a high I wants to talk a lot about the intro stuff. So does a high S. They really want to talk about how your weekend was and how your kids are doing and how X, Y, and Z. And so I'm not deferring to my natural style in sales communication. I'm reading the room of what is their style and what do they want in the conversation. A high D, at me, for instance, if you don't get into the meat, then I'm kind of pissed. Like, I'm counting the seconds until you do. A high I, if you don't stay there with them, if you don't ask them questions about X, Y, and Z, then they're going to think you're rude. They're going to think that they really wanted to stay there. So I'm reading where the breath point is in the conversation in those 3 case scenarios. And then at the point that we hit that breath point, then I'm saying, okay, well, I didn't call to bug you about, let's say that they said they're going on vacation. So I didn't call to bug you about all the details about your vacation. And I get to the meat of, have they heard of my company before? So there are going to be 2 different options. Obviously, they've either heard of your company or they haven't. Ta-da, brilliant. If they say that they've heard of your company. So if, let's say I say, so curious to know if you've come across FlipTheScript before. If they say it, they've heard of my company. The number one sin I see is people continue to blanket pitch. If they've heard of my company, I need to know one question. Let's see if you can guess. Jump into the chat. They say they've heard of your company. What's the question that I'm wondering when they tell me they've heard of my company? What's an example of it? Yeah, bingo. You're all brilliant. You're all brilliant. Adam, is this good or bad? Chris, that's a great point. Good or bad? What have you heard? How long ago? You all are nailing this. So at this point, what do they know? That's another great example. So there's a litany of different things that I really want to know at this point. And the greatest sin is that you continue to blanket pitch. So if they say, yeah, I've come across FlipTheScript, that's the point where I would take off my pitching hat, so to speak, and I would go into detective mode. I would want to know how they come across us. When did they come across us? Have they worked with us before? If they worked with us, was it a good or bad experience? Did they see the outcome that they wanted? You don't know at that point, and they're going to be testing you at this point. If they say yes, they're going to be testing you on if you, again, continue to go, because salespeople have been so brutal, and it's because of how we're KPI'd. I don't think it's necessarily our fault. Because we've been so brutal about continuing to pitch, you're going to have to prove at every single juncture of the sales cycle and during the cold call that you are not a typical salesperson, meaning you're not going to run over them. You do know who they are. You're going to take care of them. You notice things about them. You're here to solve their problems. You're not going to sell them stuff they don't need. You're not going to sell them at a high ticket price. Like, you're in their corner. And that's going to have to be a consistent process. I almost view it like 50 first dates. That has to be a consistent process throughout the sales cycle. When you didn't act like a salesperson on the first call, you have to act like you weren't a salesperson on the second call, and like you're not a salesperson on the third call. The typical salesperson of, I'm going to push and product feature dump all the way, into oblivion. So if they say, yes, I've heard of your company, I would want to know all the questions that you're just asking. You don't know at that point if they were a past user, they loved your product, they loved your company, and they would love to buy again, so let's go ahead and set up a meeting. Or if they were dating the CEO of your company and just had a brutal, glass dropping breakup and now hate your company because of it, not for anything that you did, but because of that relationship. The reality is you don't know. You're flying in blind. And so I would want to, the one thing that we are fighting in sales is visibility. People are not going to readily open up their pain, open up their problem, open up things that are going on with their organization, because they know that the more that they do, A, they don't know what you're going to do with it. B, they don't know, they know that the more that they open up their pain or problems, the more it's going to increase the price tag of whatever they have to buy from you. So the quintessential example is people pretend like they don't like something or they don't need something. So you're fighting visibility. So if they say yes, I would start to ask them questions around how they know about you. Let's go into if they say no, I haven't heard of you. So at this point, I would take them into a four stage, what I call a prospect pact. And a prospect pact is going to be pretty simple. It's going to be an agreement or a pact, a friendly pact between you and your buyer, prospective buyer, on what's going to happen so that you earn or you ask or get buy-in for the right to pitch. So there are 4 different pieces to this. I would lead with, got it, how about this? There are 4 different pieces to this: the commitment, the agenda, the outcome, and the consent. So the commitment is their give, essentially. So here's an example of what you can use. And I would use this one verbatim. I would practice it in the mirror over and over and over and over till I had it. And then you can start to venture off. It's like any dance move. Learn it verbatim in the beginning, and then you can start to add in some flair once you've got it. So the commitment is their give. Got it. How about this? You give me the next 20 seconds. The second piece is the agenda of what's going to happen during that time. So to give you my best dog and pony show on who FlipTheScript is and why I thought we might be a good fit for you and your team over at Oracle. The third piece is going to be the outcome. And this is going to be the get, what they get from the situation. So I want you all to jump in the chat. When salespeople approach you at the mall with a clipboard or whatever, they cold call you, what's the number one thing that you really want from them? Run away. Yes. Clinton, bingo. You all already got it. To leave. Look at this. Leave you alone. Escape. Run away. Ask somebody else. Get to the point. Bingo. You're all getting it. So I want you to use that as your leverage, meaning that's their get, is that you'll go away. And the degree, alacrity, and aggression of which you will go away. So I'd say that's your tool, because that's the one thing that they want. So how about this? You give me the next 20 seconds, that's the give. And the outcome is that at the end of that 20 seconds, you can tell me whether it makes sense to continue the conversation from there, meaning I'll go away. The fourth piece of this is consent. You want to ask for their buy-in, so we want to dole out respect to our buyer. There are 2 different places where we're doling out respect to our buyer in the beginning stage of this call. Number 1 is we're giving them the respect of our time by researching them. And number 2, we're asking for their permission to do something. So this is a quintessential permission-based ask. But how about this? You give me the next 20 seconds to give you my best dog and pony show on who we are and why I thought we might be a good fit for you and your team over at Oracle. And at the end of that 20 seconds, you can tell me whether it makes sense to continue the conversation from there. Is that a deal? This should have about 95% conversion based on all the teams that I've worked with and seen. If you want to spike that up to 100, like anything, lower the commitment, up the get. So up the amount and aggression of which you'll go away. So you could say, how about this? You let me ask you 2 questions. And after those 2 questions, if I'm still not relevant, I'll never call you again. Sounds crazy, right? You'll get 100% of people saying yes. So if you want to play with these values, like if you want to get 100%, I would suggest going with this one in the beginning because it should be good enough to get you 95%. Most people convert at this point, but if you want to up the ante, you could say that this is the lightest version. The second heavy or medium version is at the end of that 20 seconds. If you don't like what you hear, I promise my next call won't be an announced, meaning you won't call them, again, without their permission for you to call them. And then the most aggressive is I'll never call you again. So you'll get very, very high conversion in all 3 case scenarios. On the low end, 95, but this is going to be the prospect pact. And this is just at some level of pact agreement, between you and your prospective buyer on what's going to happen. So you don't evaporate the ambiguity. So one of their fears is that you're going to launch into a monologue like I often do on all the things your product does and they can't get out of it. So they hang up. So one of the things you're fighting here is that that's not going to happen. You want this to be a very, very respectful engagement. You have called them out of the blue. At the base level, and all this I'm sure are going to be hashed up into clips and put all over smeared all over LinkedIn, to where people are going to think I'm some kind of crazy dragon lady. At the high level, when you call someone, it actually is pretty rude. You have especially if you don't have a specific problem that you know that they have, that you are solving for. You know the information of their buyer persona, their company, and something in specific that you're positive that they are running into. So I'd say 99.9% repeating, nay 100% of cold calls are disrespectful. And the reason they're disrespectful is my buyer, or I, as a prospect, am going about my day and I'm prioritizing a certain amount of things according to what I see fit. When someone calls me, they are telling me from a high level, it's not important enough. I don't care really what's important to you in terms of priority. I'm going to insert myself and I'm going to prioritize for you something that I want. So I want you to roll that math along in your brain. I had, I think it was a week and a half ago, there was someone who's known in the industry who I don't really have a relationship with. They called me. I got a cold call on a Saturday, and I'm running. I think you're all doing the math of my reaction, but I'm on a run, and I get this random dial. I'm like, surely no one's going to cold call me on a Saturday. So out of just genuine lamb to the slaughter curiosity, I pick up, and the person says, "Hey, this is blank, from LinkedIn." I'm like, okay. And they're like, and they had sent me a couple of requests to do this thing, speak at this engagement. And they're like, I have this speaking engagement that you'd be perfect for. And it took everything in my body to not yell at them, perfect for you. You have something that you want. And in your mind, probably not after this conversation, I'm perfect for you, but you're not perfect for me. All you've done now is interrupted my Saturday and my run to tell me that something is great for you. But the get for me wasn't high. The get for me wasn't anything. It was a give, right? So when we're calling our prospects, there needs to be some level of value or a give. But I would just keep in mind that you're on borrowed time because you have just prioritized something for them that they didn't prioritize themselves. Keep in mind the person had emailed me, I digress, like 15, 20 times asking for this thing. And I'm like, if I wanted it, if I thought it was perfect for me, I would have responded to the email, but I didn't. It's a cold call. So we're in sales. We have to do this. But I would keep that in the back of your mind of their perspective of what you've done whenever they pick up the phone. So the meat of the elevator pitch, let's assume, here 95% of the time, they're going to say like, yeah, go ahead, give me your shot. I would bridge into a elevator pitch, if you will. And this should be a structure of what your company does, essentially the problems that you solve for prospects. But you want to be very careful to the third thing that's important about outreach, to take care of their ego in the process. So how we can do this is I would lead with, so like I mentioned, I was really pulled in by your article about me section, re-mention the personalization. By the way, low-hanging fruit title is not personalization. So like I mentioned, I was really pulled in by your, article that you wrote online. At the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, blank, and I would put their role, care about, and give their one business metric. So at the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, VPs of sales, for instance, care about quota attainment. So you really want to know, if you don't know this, no problem. I have been there 1,000 times. I would get to know my buyer and say, what's the one metric that you're metriced on? There is a quantitative metric for every single type of prospect of what they're geared after. So at the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, VPs of sales care about quota attainment. And I would go into either 1 to 3 current problems that your buyer is usually running into. So I hear a lot, of like, okay, well, what if I lead with one problem in an email or 2 to 3 problems in this pitch and they aren't running into any of those problems? It's like, well, one of two things. Either they're not really your buyer, meaning that buyer persona isn't typically your buyer, or you don't know them well enough to have teased out problems that they run into. You should know your buyer well enough, arguably, and this is a long climb for salespeople. I know this is a very high bar, but you should know your buyer enough to know what are the problems that they run into. So AEs, I can walk on the floor and say, marketing leads, am I right? And they're like, oh my gosh, marketing leads are terrible and they don't understand us. And they're right to some degree, of like, these don't have any buyer intent and this wasn't even the right person. And they make me push people to events, and I don't really get any kickback. Or, I could walk into a team of AEs and say, putting data into the CRM, notes into the CRM, am I right? And they're like, oh my gosh, it takes so long and it's not revenue generating and X, Y, and Z. Or I could even say AEs, qualified meetings from sales development, am I right? And they're like, oh, they're never qualified. They don't have buyer intent. They're not the right person, X, Y, and Z. But the reason I know those is because that's my buyer. Like, I want to know the problems that my buyer is normally running into. So in this bridge, I would describe for them 3 problems that you solve for. But again, we want to asterisk mark that we're taking care of their ego. So if you walk into a floor and say, we work with VPs of sales who can never hit quota. I work with BDRs who can't book a single freaking meeting. I work with BDRs who have never hit their actual booked meetings goal. If I led like that, a great example being when I first started FlipTheScript, it was an after-hours series. I was at G2 at the time, and that was my normal 8 to 5 job. And I just wanted to, publish some of the methods that had made my team successful. So I did it as an after-hours series. That's why the tour's still after hours. And I wanted to make it free. And so they developed a landing page, and they said, FlipTheScript, a series for reps who can't hit quota. And I was like, oh my God, my eyes are bleeding. No one's going to show up to that. And the reason I knew that is they would have to someone would have to self-admit, maybe inaccurately so, that they would have to be someone who wasn't hitting quota, and they would have to admit that to themselves to want to attend the series. So I said, reposition it. FlipTheScript, a series for driven, hungry reps who always want to get 1% better. So you want to take care of the profile in your head that you're building so that it's something that your prospect wants to fit into. So how you can do that in the context of mentioning that with problems, because it's tricky. How do I intertwine a problem, that they're running into without essentially attributing it to them as to why they're running into it? So I'd say we work with and give their role who want to, and give an ideal state. They want to push more quota. They want to help their reps get to the next rung. They want to make conversion better for their team, but they just don't understand. They're just bereft of, and I would give an element, whether that's knowledge, whether that's they just don't have the data of where the reps are screwing up on the phone, that's making their prospects hang up on them. They want to do the right things. They're after the right things. They're the hero in the story. They're the person that's after helping their team, but they just can't surface, they just X, Y, and Z. They don't have this one element, that not having this element hinders them from getting to that ideal state. That normally, and in any case scenario, most people couldn't hit this current state, or couldn't hit this ideal state if put in the same position. So you want to protect their ego to a perspective of, you're describing the problems of they want to achieve this thing, but they just can't surface, like they want to help their reps quarterback deals, but they can't surface which deal is they're in trouble quickly enough before it's too late, before the deal's churned. So the culprit in this situation, the villain in this situation, is not them. The villain in this situation is this piece of information, data, speed, etc., that is the one piece that your company can fill in. So I'd finish off with, are you running into any of this in your day-to-day, or am I just rambling here? So they'll end up essentially answering the latter, not the former. So another big sin that I see within outreach, and this is just reading as a prospect, is we're putting the bar too high of what they have to agree to for them to just keep the conversation going, right? So Chris Voss would call this a yes trap. Of we ask a question that, like, a great example is this relevant to you? And they know they're not answering, is this relevant to you? They're answering, do I want to keep going in this conversation and enter a sales cycle? And because they know that, they say, they don't answer, they say no, not because they're not running into it, but because they don't want the ultimate price tag of going into a sales cycle. So you want to choke down this bar because you want to keep the conversation going. So I think through very heavily, and then we'll get into the types of questions you can ask. I think through very heavily, when I'm walking through a town square, and let's see if you guys can, guys and gals can guess this on the line. Have you ever been walking through a town like downtown and you see like a street performer? There is a risk, and you looking at that person who's dancing, at that person who's giving a monologue, and what is the risk that you're at risk of if you dead on look at them? Like someone's doing a dance routine, you're in a downtown square, and you want to look at it. Bingo, Susan already got it. You're going to have to engage. Look at this. You guys are brilliant. I'm serious. You feel like you have to give them money. You're afraid that they're going to pull you in. You're afraid that they will single you out. And so you don't look at them. So you'll end up giving them the side eye because you want to look, but you don't want to get pulled in. That is the same point that your prospects are at this point. They want to know what your product is, but they don't want to get wrapped into a sales cycle. That's why Forrester did a report on all the things you consider before you buy something. There's 20 different variables. Top 3 are peer-to-peer, industry influencers, and reviews. The last variable that people consider for product information is salespeople. It's the last thing that they want to consider, not because they don't believe that you have information they need, but because they're terrified to end up in a sales cycle. They don't want to be in a sales cycle. They don't want to be pushed on. They don't want to be sold to. They don't want you to talk all the product, feature, benefit, etc., that you offer. And so they're going to give you the side eye. The side eye is, downloading content or doing research on the web without you even knowing. But people don't want to look at the performer, so to speak, by way of requesting a demo or talking to a salesperson because they're afraid that you're going to put them into a sales cycle. So you want to lower this bar of what they have to respond to, to keep going into the conversation. So I have to speed up here. I only have 7 minutes left. At this point, I would take them into a 1.5 to a 5 minute. They say, no, you're not just rambling here. That thing on quota attainment was interesting. And I would take them into a 1.5 to 5 minute question period where you are understanding their current state. No shorter than a 1.5 because I wouldn't believe you have a narrative. No longer than 5 minutes because I don't believe a decision maker would spend that time with you who has budget. But I really want to understand the things that are going on with them in their organization. So a couple of tips here. I can't go too deep because of time's sake and I went on too many monologues. Couple of tips here is number one, to ask as many questions that are non-agenda driven. The only agenda is to understand. So I used to comp my reps on if they could log off the cold call and give me a 3 to 5 minute diatribe on what's happening at that person's organization, I'd give them $100. All my reps were like, well, I'm going to make so much money off of you, Becc. And I'm like, yeah, but when you book the meeting, I'm going to make $400. So point being, I would start to relinquish as much as you can the hand of, I want to sell them something, and ask them questions on trying to get after their current state. There's a number of different ways you can do this. Overview questions, meaning, can you tell me a little bit about, can you help me understand? If they end a sentence in a statement, I'd say, what do you mean by that? In regards to, you mean in terms of to just get them to keep going? A quick tip for if they ask a question, if they say a statement, your job's to ask a question. If they ask a question, your job's to ask a question. So if they say a statement, you black out, you don't know what to say next, but you want them to keep going, just say in terms of and they'll keep going. If they ask a question, I'd say that's a good question. Why do you ask? To get after the intent. So a great example being my dad last night, again, I'm home in Dallas, and my dad last night, he said, where did these cookies come from? I said, I don't know. They're downstairs. Ask mom. And he goes, oh, shoot, we do ask questions that aren't the real question. I started laughing because he hears about sales too much. And I said, what was your real question? He said, my real question was, can I have one? So there's a difference in the questions that people ask and what the information that they're really after. So I would counter with, that's a good question. Why do you ask? But again, the goal here is that you get into a 1.5 to 5 minute data gathering period where you understand what's happening in their org, that you're after comprehension understanding. So a couple of quick tips from a litmus perspective on, are you asking questions to lead them somewhere, or are you asking questions to genuinely understand? If you have ever been on the line, which I have, and you've asked a question, and while they're answering, you're thinking of your next question and you're panicked, that means that you're not after understanding. Me included. Another litmus test is if you ask a question and you can't remember the answer that they just told you, you also weren't after understanding. So I'd start to ask questions, situational close questions. I'd use these sparingly. These are qualifying questions. These are short current state questions. How many team members do you have? What's the team that you oversee? These are important, but usually very little value to your prospect. So I'd ask them sparingly. The third type of question is open problem or pain, meaning you are asking them a question that essentially makes them talk about or self-uncover a problem that they have or a pain point that they're running into. Open being defined as it's an open-ended answer where they can take it a different direction. Closed question being defined as it's a finite answer. Yes, no, 32, Texas, to the left. But you want it, these are just the 3 types of questions. I'm not going to go into the last 2 because of time's sake, but these questions are questions you can ask in discovery too. There's about 20 different types that I've developed, but these 3 questions are the ones that I'm asking the most. Overview questions and open problem or pain questions. But your goal is to get your buyer to talk about their current state so you can figure out what's going on. So what, if there is a problem, how to diagnose that problem, and so on and so forth. So this should be a 1.5 to 5 minutes after you get, you go through this elevator pitch. They say, I am running into this problem, and you say, what do you mean? And they say, yeah, so my reps, on and on and on, and they start to go into a diatribe. You get them to go further. You're after gathering data of what's happening in their org. And at this point, you've either one of 3 things has happened. You've either hit the breath point of the conversation, meaning you can tell that they're ready to move on. From a high level, there is a finite amount of questions that you can ask before someone gets pissed. So the reason I love overview questions, I'm just going to ping my next appointment. I'm going to go 5 minutes after. Sorry, Jimmy, if you're out there on the line, I'm really sorry. I have to go 5 more minutes for comprehension. But from a high level, there are 3 types of scenarios of which I know that I need to end this portion. Number 1, I feel like I have the narrative of what's going on in their company. Number 2, I have hit the 5-minute mark and I need to close out the conversation. You need to be very careful of that you feed them, but you don't feed them enough to where they don't want dinner, right? So that you've got enough information, but you don't answer any questions. So this is another piece of, they ask you questions, heaven forbid you give them pricing on the phone. I would view it as every question that I answer for them, that I'm paying them out $100, because the more information that they gather from me on what I do, the less likely they are to jump on the discovery to figure that out. But the second point would be, I hit the 5-minute brink, of they've been talking for 5 minutes and I need to transition out. Or the third one is that you can hear in their voice that you've hit the breath point, they're ready to move on. At any one of those 3 points, I would go into closing out the conversation. So there is a framework here for what you need to do. I'm only going to hit 2 pieces here and then end with a bit of an analogy. But the two pieces here I'd think about is, well, I know I called unannounced. That's the only time that I would use wasted text, because I've hit the point of the conversation where I essentially want to pivot out and set up a next time. Do you have your calendar handy? How does Tuesday at 2 look? They'll say Tuesday at 2 for what? This is the most important piece on the left-hand side of closing out. You want to give them a summary of whatever you discussed, so whatever you heard. So this should be anywhere from 15 seconds on the minimum up to 30, 45 seconds at the maximum. But you want to summarize for them what they said to you. So number one, they have a comprehensive look of why it would be a good idea to jump on the next call. But number two, you're conveying to them that you're listening. So I don't have too much time to go into it, but introverts and extroverts, they both exist. There's some level of scale of that you're an introvert or an extrovert. It's not digital that you are one or you are the other. I, for instance, oddly enough, you wouldn't guess it, but I'm a very, very heavy introvert. And an introvert is looking to internally for the narrative and for to be entertained. So they recharge by being alone. And an introvert will look off whenever they're thinking about something, whether they're answering your question or they're listening to you. An extrovert will look you dead in the eye and not be listening at all in some case scenarios. So point being, the only true cue that you are listening to your prospect is that you can tell them in summary what they just told you in the last 5 minutes. So I give them some level of summary on what they just told you in the last 5 minutes. So, very, very important that we were listening to them. And then I would say Tuesday at 2, I want to hear more about where you're headed and see if this is a fit and how we might be able to support you. On the right-hand side, there's one piece that's very important. I would say on Tuesday, if this is not a fit, I promise not to be the rep that sends you endless follow-up. You want to end with a prospect pact. But the most important part is you want to say, what else? What else would you like to cover? What else would you like to go into on Tuesday? And the reason you want to do this is threefold. Number one, if they can't give you a reason why they jump on the call, they are a very high candidate for no-show. Industry statistics showed that you're going to be 15 to 20% more likely to get a no-show if they booked the appointment over a call versus an email. And the reason being, I would guess, is they have pressure on a call to make you happy because they want to feel, good about who they are. So you want to make sure that there's a reason that they want to jump on the next call so that you can mitigate against no-shows. The second reason is you want to get buy-in from them. So there's a number of different studies, but TLDR, we value anywhere from 15 to 20 times more something that we worked for, earned, or had involvement in than something that we didn't. So they've done a number of different studies on how people price items if they develop the item or if they didn't develop the item. It's going to be 15 to 20x more pricey in their mind because they put in. So point being, you want to get some type of buy-in from them in terms of what you're going to cover. But the third case scenario is if they do no-show, then you have something to follow up with them about. Hey, did I mess up? Did I screw up in this conversation? Because, I didn't see you on the line earlier. Sorry, I missed you on the line earlier. Did I mess up? Last time we talked, I thought that you wanted to cover X, Y, and Z, so I have to think, that I missed the ball somewhere in here. But you want to have the level of data of why it was a good idea for them to jump on the call. Number one, to remind them because people are busy. But number two, to be able to follow up, if they do a no-show on the line, then you have something that you wanted to cover in the call. And then you can close out. Great. So I'll send over an invite. Other than that, let me know if I can be of any help in the meantime. But those are the two most important parts. I'm going to end with saying this because it's very, very big and important in my brain, very, very fired up in my brain right now. There's a number of different ways you can sell. This is just a structure for a cold call, but there are 3 different ways that you can sell in the industry. Number one, and I'm going to end with this, so don't yell at me. Number one is you can product or feature sell. And so I know that this is a big no-no for sales. It's what's done most often, but product and feature selling is like someone, like a patient walking into a doctor's office, and a doctor, without asking them questions, describes 5 medications, what they do, the pros and cons to both, and has the patient self-diagnose what they think the problem is, what the pain is, what they think the problem is, and what medication will help alleviate their problem. And the risk in all of that is they don't know. They're not the expert. You should be, right? So that's the first type of selling, and it's extremely dangerous. The second type of selling, which is an even bigger culprit in the industry, is selling to pain. So selling to pain is the patient walks into the doctor's office and the doctor asks questions about the pain only. Does your arm hurt? You know, what hurts my arm? How long has it been hurting? 6 weeks. You know, how badly does it hurt? It hurts on a scale of 1 to 10, a 9. What does that mean to you at your home life? Well, it means that I can't pick up my kids and go for a walk without any level of pain. And they're using that information to manipulate the patient to buy a medication. So after they get all of that pain data, then they go into all the different medications. And the reason that that's the bigger culprit is progressive sellers are selling towards pain. And what they're doing is they're just trying to hype up the pain that the person's feeling and get them to talk about it, so they can manipulate the buyer into believing they need a medication that the doctor at that point doesn't know that they need, because they don't know what they're solving for. And I say that with all aggression and all passion, because that is who we have been as a community. And I hope that's not who we are tomorrow. So the third type of selling, which is the most buyer-centric truly, is going to be problem-centric selling. If you want more on problem-centric selling, go read Gap Selling by Keenan. This is not a product push. He doesn't even know that I'm doing this, and it's an absolutely brilliant book. But problem-centric selling is you're asking questions to understand their current state. Some of them seem arbitrary. Some of them seem like they are dead on. And the reason that you're doing that is you're trying to diagnose what's the problem that they're having, whether they knew they were having the problem or they didn't know they were having the problem. You're going to ask a couple pain questions at the beginning. Does your arm hurt? Why does it hurt? Does your arm hurt? How long has it been hurting? What's the level of degree? And then you're going to ask questions like, have you been sleeping recently more than normal? Are your eyes more dry? They seem arbitrary, but you need the answers to those questions to help to be able to diagnose what is the problem that's causing the pain. They come in for the pain, but to alleviate the pain, we need to know what the problem is, and then we solve that problem with our product. So if we don't know what the problem is, then what are we doing? We're either, best case scenario, manipulating our buyer and based on their pain level to get them to buy a medication that we don't know if they need because we don't know what's wrong with them, or we're just talking about a whole bunch of medications and making them self-diagnose. So point being, problem-centric selling is the new, I hope, new wave to where we're really solving the problems for a buyer. How you're going to do that is by the questions that you ask. You should start the journey of getting to know the questions. The second way is called pain-centric selling, Feven, I don't know if I'm messing up your name, but pain-centric selling is a bigger culprit in the industry over product feature. We know we shouldn't be doing product feature, but we don't know that we shouldn't be doing pain. We should be doing problem, from my perspective, is we're doing our buyer the most favors when we're selling based on problem and we're understanding what's happening with them. So that's everything for today. Thank you so much for tuning in a couple of minutes after. I'm going to get in major trouble with my next appointment. Thank you for tuning into this. So I hope that this helps unpack this guide a little bit more. Here's the framework. We got this. We're going to pivot the sales community. I, for the first time, believe it and realize that we can do it. And I think it lies at being about our buyer and knowing more about their world than even they do in some cases. So thank you so much for attending, and for JustCall for helping me put the tour together and this asset together. I hope that this is helpful, and tune in next week for the asset number 3, where I'm going to go into trigger-based relevance, core static relevance, personalization. What are the differences between all three, and where do you put all three of those in a playbook if you believe in personalization or if you don't, so that you can make the biggest impact on your buyers. So that's it, everything for today. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending and for being so engaged in the chat. I hope you have a great, great, great rest of your week. Bye.